For years, I was the woman who baked pies for every harvest, the neighbor who always had a warm meal ready. I thought my children would cherish the orchard as we did. But the day after Richard's funeral, my son drove me to Maple Hollow Road and told me I was no longer his responsibility. That night, I learned it had all been planned. The forged will, the secret sale, the life they intended to strip from me. And something in me changed forever. The March wind cut through my black wool coat as I stood on the church steps, watching neighbors file past with murmured condolences and casserole dishes wrapped in foil. Brooksville was the kind of place where people still brought food when someone died, as if a baked ziti could fill the space a man left behind. Richard had wanted it simple, no long eulogies, just a short service and a burial on the slope behind the orchard. 42 years of marriage, and he still had a way of making his wishes sound final. I kept my eyes on the row of bare apple trees across the road, their branches twisted like the years we had weathered together. David had flown in from New York the night before, his suit too sharp for this small Vermont town. His face set in that detached expression he had perfected since leaving home at 18. He stood near the hearse with his hands in his pockets, talking to a man from the funeral home as if it were a business meeting. Samantha had arrived in a rush that morning from Boston, her hair pulled into a sleek knot, a designer scarf wrapped around her neck. She dabbed her eyes with a tissue, but I knew my daughter well enough to see the performance in it. When the service ended, we walked together down the hill to the gravesite. The sky was a cold, washed-out blue, the kind that made you feel smaller just looking at it. The pastor spoke briefly about Richard's devotion to the land, his work ethic, how he had employed local boys during summer harvests. I stood between my children, feeling the stiffness in David's arm when it circled my shoulders, the dampness of Samantha's tissue brushing my hand. The thud of earth on the coffin echoed in my chest, and I thought about the years we had built this place from nothing, the mortgage payments we scraped together, the storms that nearly broke us. I thought about Richard's hands rough from pruning, the way he always smelled faintly of apples and cedar. Afterward, the crowd thinned, people drifting back to their cars. A few lingered to press my hands and tell me to call if I needed anything. Clara Bishop from the bakery hugged me tight, her apron dusting my coat with flour. Harvey Cole from the bank nodded solemnly. Even Olivia Rhodes from the Gazette stopped by, her eyes sharper than her words. By the time the last of them had gone, the afternoon light was slanting low and the cold had settled deep into my bones. We walked back toward the farmhouse together. The gravel crunched under our shoes, and for a moment, I let myself imagine we were just another family returning from a long day. The three of us stepping into a warm kitchen, the smell of stew on the stove. Inside, the air still held the faint scent of Richard's pipe tobacco, though he had given it up years ago. I set my purse on the counter and slipped out of my coat, my fingers stiff from the chill. David stood in the middle of the kitchen, looking around like a surveyor. His eyes moved from the worn oak cabinets to the wide plank floors, the beams Richard had sanded and sealed himself. Samantha was by the window, staring out at the orchard, her scarf still knotted tightly at her throat. The silence was thick, heavy with everything we weren't saying. I filled the kettle at the sink, the sound of water rushing into metal louder than I expected. My hands wanted the comfort of making tea, of doing something ordinary. David cleared his throat. The tone was casual, but his eyes were fixed, calculating. "Mom, we should probably talk about what comes next." For a second I thought he meant grief, or the planting season, or even the bills. But the way he glanced at Samantha, the slight nod they shared, told me this was not about mourning. "What do you mean?" I asked, setting the kettle on the stove. He stepped closer, resting his palms flat on the counter. "The orchard, the house, everything. We should think about the future." Samantha turned from the window, her smile practiced. "It's a lot to manage on your own, Mom. You've done so much, but maybe it's time to let someone else take over." The words slid over me like cold water. I thought of Richard's last days, how he had insisted we keep the orchard running, how he had told me in the quiet of our bedroom that the land should never be sold to people who didn't care for it. My voice felt distant when I said, "I can manage just fine." David's eyes narrowed slightly, and he gave a small shrug. "We'll see," he said, as if the matter had already been decided. The kettle began to hum a low sound that seemed to underline the shift in the room. I poured the water into 3 mugs anyway, my hands steady, though my heart was not. We drank in silence, each of us measuring the others, and I knew without knowing the details that something had just begun. By the time the sun dipped behind the ridge, the kitchen smelled of roast chicken and rosemary. I had set the table the way Richard always liked for family dinners, mismatched plates we had collected over the years, and the heavy silverware from his parents' wedding. The candles flickered against the glass front cabinets, casting a soft light that I hoped might ease the stiffness that had settled over the house. David appeared first, phone in hand, scrolling as he walked in. He slipped the device into his pocket without looking up, pulling out a chair. "Morning." Samantha followed, her hair loosened now, though the scarf was still looped at her neck. She glanced at the chicken, then at me, and gave a smile that did not reach her eyes. We sat down, the 3 of us, and for a moment there was only the sound of cutlery against china. I asked about their trips back to town, how the roads had been, if their hotels were comfortable. David gave short answers, his attention half on the food, half on some calculation running behind his eyes. Samantha mentioned that Boston was busy this time of year and how hard it was to get away. I let the conversation drift, waiting for it to settle into something natural, but it never did. It was David who shifted the tone. "Mom, we should talk about the orchard." I set down my fork. "What about it?" He leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers together. "Sterling Developments made another offer. They are ready to move quickly." His voice was smooth, practiced the same tone he probably used with clients in New York. Samantha nodded, adding that it was the best price anyone would ever get. $8.2 million. "Mom, think about what that means for you." I felt my chest tighten. Richard had refused every offer, no matter how high. He believed the land was more than numbers on paper. I told them so, my voice steady. "Your father said this place should never be sold to people who don't care for it. This is our home." David's smile was thin. "It is just land, Mom, and it is too much for you to manage now. The company will take care of everything. You could live anywhere you want, travel, relax." I pushed a piece of chicken around my plate, unwilling to look at him. "The orchard is not a burden. It is my life." Samantha reached across the table, her fingers grazing mine. "No one is saying you have to leave with nothing. We would make sure you are taken care of." The words landed like a stone. "We, not me, not your family, we—" I asked if they had discussed this before today. Samantha hesitated, glancing at David. He reached down beside his chair and lifted a slim leather folder, placing it on the table between the salt and pepper shakers. "We wanted to wait until after the funeral, but we have been talking to Dad about this for over a year." He opened the folder and slid a document toward me. I recognized the format instantly. A will. My breath caught. The pages were crisp, the type clean. At the bottom was a signature that looked like Richard's, but too strong, too steady for the man whose hand had trembled from pain in his final weeks. According to this, the orchard and the house were to pass directly to David and Samantha. My role was a footnote. They would manage the property, decide its future, and ensure my comfort. The language was formal, but the meaning was clear. "Where did this come from?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. David leaned forward. "From Dad. He wanted to make sure things were handled efficiently. We can't ignore what's best for the business." I ran my thumb over the signature, remembering the last time Richard had signed anything official. It had been shaky, uneven, and I had held the paper steady for him. "This is not what your father told me," I said quietly. Samantha's smile faltered. "Sometimes he told you what you wanted to hear. He told us he was worried about you running things alone." David's eyes locked on mine. "This is the right decision, Mom. You need to accept that." The roast chicken had gone cold. The candles sputtered in their holders. I folded the will and slid it back toward David. "I will need time to think," I said. His jaw tightened. but he nodded. "We are on a tight schedule. Sterling wants an answer soon." Samantha began gathering her plate, the scrape of porcelain loud in the silence. I stacked the dishes, rinsed them at the sink, my mind already circling the questions that document had raised. Outside the orchard lay in darkness the bare branches etched against the faint glow of town lights. I dried my hands on a towel, feeling the weight of their eyes on my back, and knew the conversation was far from over. I carried the folded dish towel to the hook by the pantry and hung it there, but my hands lingered on the fabric. The will had burned itself into my mind, that neat, confident signature mocking the memory of Richard's trembling hand as he tried to sign his last check just weeks before. He had struggled to hold the pen, his fingers stiff and weak, the ink skipping across the paper. What I had seen tonight did not belong to a dying man. It belonged to someone who wanted to appear strong. Upstairs in our bedroom, the air was cooler, the faint scent of cedar still clinging to Richard's dresser. I sat on the edge of the bed, the springs creaking softly under my weight, and studied the worn rug beneath my feet. Sleep was a stranger. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw David's face leaning forward, his voice calm but loaded, Samantha's hand brushing mine with false warmth. The room felt too big without Richard, the quiet too loud. I lay down, pulling the quilt up to my chin, and stared at the faint moonlight filtering through the curtains. My mind ran through possibilities. If Richard had truly wanted this change, why would he not tell me? We had shared every decision about the orchard, every risk, every loan. Even when we argued together. The idea that he had sat with our children to discuss cutting me out was so far from the man I knew that it made my stomach twist. Sometime after midnight, I heard a floorboard creak below. The sound was followed by a low murmur, not the shifting of an old house, but the steady rhythm of a voice. I slipped out of bed, my bare feet cold against the floor, and eased the door open. The hallway was dark except for a sliver of light at the bottom of the stairs. I moved slowly, pressing my hand to the wall to keep my balance, and stopped just before the last step. David's voice carried from the kitchen. It was sharper than it had been over dinner, clipped and direct. He was on the phone. "Yes, I have the paperwork in hand." "No, she has no idea." I leaned closer, the wood of the banister cool under my palm. He paused, listening, then said, "We need to move the closing up. End of the week if possible. I don't want her talking to anyone in town." A beat of silence, then I'll make sure she doesn't get in the way. I felt the blood drain from my face. The tone was not the voice of a son managing family affairs. It was the voice of someone managing an obstacle. My fingers tightened on the banister. Orchard, my home, was no longer just a point of disagreement. It was a target, and I was standing between it and people willing to push me aside. Samantha's softer voice joined his muffled but still clear enough. "If she resists, can't we just—" She trailed off and David cut in. "No, it's cleaner this way. Once the documents are filed, there's nothing she can do." A chair scraped against the floor and I backed up the stairs, heart pounding. I reached the bedroom and eased the door closed, leaning against it until my breathing slowed. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the quilt's stitched pattern. The knowledge settled like a stone in my chest. They had planned this long before the funeral, maybe even before Richard's final weeks. Every hug, every tear, every polite word was part of the performance. My fingers brushed the edge of the nightstand drawer where I kept an envelope with my passport and a few important papers. Richard had once told me to always keep a copy of the deed to the small parcel in my maiden name somewhere safe. At the time, it had felt unnecessary, even paranoid. Now it felt like a lifeline. The clock on the dresser ticked toward 2. Downstairs, the light clicked off and the house sank into silence again. I lay back and stared at the ceiling beams Richard had refinished one summer, trying to anchor myself in memories that were mine alone. Sleep never came. My mind replayed every word I had overheard, each one tightening the knot in my chest. When the first pale light of dawn crept through the curtains, I was still awake, my body heavy but my mind sharp. I knew that whatever they were planning, I had only a narrow window to protect what Richard and I had built. The orchard outside was still bare, but I could almost see the blossoms that would come in spring. I could not let them bloom for someone else's profit. David knocked on my bedroom door just after breakfast, his voice carrying that polite firmness he used when he had already made a decision. He said he wanted to take me to see a place he thought I would like, a retirement community outside of town. Samantha was by the front door with her coat already on, a travel mug of coffee in her hand. The look they shared told me this was not a suggestion. I slipped into my heavier coat and followed them outside. The air was crisp, the kind of late winter morning where the frost still clung to the grass. David's SUV gleamed in the driveway, black paint catching the pale sunlight. He held the back door open for me with a tight smile, and I climbed in my bag, resting against my feet. Samantha sat in the passenger seat, her gaze fixed ahead as David started the engine. We drove through the center of Brooksville, past the brick post office, and the diner where Richard and I used to get coffee on Saturday mornings. My hands were folded in my lap, and I kept my eyes on the storefronts slipping by. We reached the intersection where the highway stretched toward the larger towns, but instead of merging onto it, David kept straight. The buildings thinned, replaced by open fields and patches of woods. After a few more miles, he turned onto Maple Hollow Road. The narrow pavement curved between stands of maple and birch, their bare branches arching overhead like ribs. I had driven this road before during Apple Festival deliveries, but never this far down in winter. The silence inside the car grew heavier. Samantha shifted in her seat, took a sip from her mug, and said nothing. I watched the familiar landmarks disappear, replaced by stretches of snow-dusted pasture and the occasional weathered barn. The road became rougher, the kind that saw more deer than cars. My fingers tightened around the strap of my bag. Something in David's posture, the way his hands gripped the wheel, told me this was not a detour meant to surprise me with good news. He slowed the SUV and pulled onto a patch of gravel by the tree line. The engine idled, filling the air with a low hum. He put the gear in park, then turned to look at me. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was cold enough to cut through the cabin. "From now on, you are not my responsibility." The words hung between us, sharp and deliberate. I glanced at Samantha, hoping for some sign of protest. Her eyes stayed on her hands, fingers wrapped around the coffee mug, knuckles pale. She didn't speak. I opened my mouth, but nothing came. The air in the car seemed thinner, my pulse loud in my ears. David reached for the button to unlock the doors. "You can get out here. There's a gas station about 5 miles up the road. I'm sure you can call one of your friends." I stared at him, searching for any trace of the boy who used to run through the orchard in his bare feet, who would bring me wildflowers clutched in small hands. All I saw was a man who had already decided I was an obstacle to be moved. My fingers felt stiff as I reached for the door handle. The cold hit me as soon as I stepped onto the gravel. The sound of the door closing was followed by the crunch of tires as the SUV rolled forward. Samantha's profile was a pale blur through the passenger window, her head tilted down. Neither of them looked back. The wind carried the scent of damp earth and distant pine. I stood still for a moment, my bag heavy on my shoulder, until the sound of the engine faded into nothing. The road stretched ahead, a thin gray ribbon vanishing into the trees. I turned my face toward the direction they had pointed, and then deliberately the other way. The frost glinted on the edge of the ditch, and the morning sun was climbing higher. I began to walk. The cold settled into my cheeks as I moved, each breath hanging in the air before breaking apart. My boots crunched on the thin crust of frost along the shoulder, the sound too loud in the stillness. Behind me, the curve of Maple Hollow Road had already swallowed the place where David's SUV had stopped. Ahead, the narrow lane curved toward the familiar hills that sheltered Brooksville. I adjusted the strap of my bag, feeling the solid weight of what I had tucked inside, and quickened my pace. The trees flanking the road stood bare and silent, the sunlight filtering through them in thin gold lines. A crow startled from a branch, its wings cutting across the sky. I glanced down into my bag and found the pill organizer still where I had packed it, the corner of my passport case, peeking from under a folded scarf, and the thick envelope holding Richard's old papers. My fingers brushed the worn edges of the deed, the one in my maiden name, and I felt a steadiness return to me. I had what mattered most. The gravel gave way to patches of cracked asphalt as the miles unspooled beneath me. My breath grew heavier and I could feel the burn in my calves, but I did not stop. Every step back toward town was a step toward taking control. David had pointed me toward that gas station like he was doing me a kindness, but I would not give him the satisfaction of imagining me there calling for help on his terms. A battered pickup rattled past the driver, lifting 2 fingers from the steering wheel in the casual greeting of the countryside. I nodded back without slowing. The smell of wood smoke drifted from somewhere ahead, carrying the memory of evenings by the stove with Richard the orchard outside shrouded in snow. I held on to that image like a handhold. After nearly an hour, the road began to rise and the open fields returned. Fences leaned under the weight of old snow, and a red barn stood in the distance, its paint faded to the color of brick dust. I stopped to catch my breath, the winter sun now higher casting the frost into a glittering sheet along the ditch. My shadow stretched long and thin in front of me. I imagined David and Samantha, now the 2 of them, heading back to the farmhouse, perhaps already congratulating themselves. They would assume I would do as instructed, call a friend, go quietly. That assumption was my advantage. I could move without them watching, without them rushing to block me before I was ready. The road dipped again, and I recognized the cluster of mailboxes at a crossroads. From here, it was another mile to the edge of town. My feet ached and my shoulders were stiff from the weight of the bag, but I kept walking. A pair of deer stood at the far end of a field, heads lifted, their breath visible in the cold. For a moment we watched each other. Then they bounded toward the tree line, their white tails flashing. The first houses of Brooksville appeared modest clapboard homes, with smoke curling from chimneys. The faint hum of traffic reached my ears, a reminder that I was stepping back into the world where I still had allies. I passed the Petersons' place, their porch lined with split logs for the wood stove, and remembered how Richard had helped mend their fence after a windstorm. The weight of those years pressed on me, but it was not weakness I felt. It was the reminder of the community I still had. By the time I reached Main Street, my legs were trembling from the walk, but I kept my head high. The familiar storefronts lined the street, their windows glowing against the pale day. The bell over the door of Bishop's Bakery jingled as I pushed it open, the warmth and scent of fresh bread wrapping around me. Clara looked up from behind the counter, her eyes widening at the sight of me. I had no plan to tell her everything yet. Secrets I knew were safest when you chose the moment to share them. Clara came around the counter and took my arm, guiding me toward the small table by the window. "You look frozen," she said, already reaching for the coffee pot. I let her pour, wrapping my hands around the mug for warmth. I told her I needed to use her phone, the landline in the back. She didn't ask why, just led me past the racks of cooling loaves into the little office that smelled of cinnamon and yeast. I closed the door behind me and picked up the receiver. My fingers found the familiar number for Franklin Pierce without hesitation. He answered on the second ring, his voice low and steady. "Eleanor, I've been trying to reach you. Where are you?" "In town," I said, in a safe place for now. "I need to tell you what happened." I took a breath and laid it out for him, from the conversation after the funeral, to the drive down Maple Hollow Road, and the document David had set in front of me. When I finished, the silence on the line stretched. "That will you saw," Franklin said finally, "is not the one Richard signed with me last year." His tone sharpened. "I know his hand and I know his intentions. They've forged something, Eleanor." I leaned against the desk, the phone cord twisting around my wrist. I thought so. His signature was too perfect. He could barely hold a pen those last months. Franklin asked if I had the deed to the separate parcel. I told him I did, and that it was in my bag safe. "Good," he said. That piece of land will be key. But listen to me carefully. You cannot confront them now. If they realize you are on to them, they will accelerate everything. Sterling will want this sale wrapped up before anyone can interfere. We need allies, and we need them quickly. I felt the truth of it settle in my chest. Who do you have in mind? I asked. Franklin began naming names. Harvey Cole at the bank, who could freeze any suspicious transactions. Mark Jensen from the agricultural office, who knew every inch of protected land in the county. Olivia Rhodes at the Gazette, who had no love for out-of-town developers. He would start reaching out quietly, but I had to move without drawing attention. Can you get to my office later today? He asked. Not yet, I said. I need to be sure they think I'm still exactly where they left me, or at least out of their way. There was a pause, then his voice dropped lower. Eleanor, promise me you will tell no one else the details until we have a plan. If David and Samantha suspect you are talking, they may try something you are not ready for. I promised, though the words felt heavy on my tongue. Franklin's certainty was a balm and a warning all at once. We agreed to speak again that afternoon, and I hung up the hum of the dial tone filling the small room. For a moment I stood there listening to the muffled clatter of pans from the bakery kitchen. Clara tapped on the door and poked her head in. "Everything all right?" she asked. I managed a small smile. "Just some business I needed to handle." She didn't press, only told me to drink my coffee before it went cold. I stepped back into the warm air of the shop, the scent of fresh bread wrapping around me again. My mind was already turning over the list Franklin had given me, each name a thread I could pull to begin unraveling what my children had tried to weave. The wind had picked up by the time I reached Franklin's office on Elm Street, tugging at my coat and carrying the sharp bite of late winter. The brass bell over the door chimed as I stepped inside, and the familiar scent of old paper and polished wood met me. Helen. His secretary looked up from her desk and gave a quick nod toward the closed door. "He's waiting for you." Franklin rose from behind his desk as I entered, his tall frame bent slightly from years of leaning over legal files. He motioned for me to sit in the leather chair across from him, then closed the door with a deliberate click. "You brought it," he said. I reached into my bag and pulled out the thick envelope, sliding it across the desk. He opened it carefully, drawing out the folded deed, the paper yellowed slightly with age. "Eleanor May Whitmore," he read aloud, eyes scanning the lines. "Recorded March 1980. 18 acres with full water rights." He tapped the page. "This runs right through the heart of the orchard's irrigation system. Without it, Sterling can't build a thing not legally." I leaned back, the weight of that truth steadying me. Richard had insisted I keep it in my name all those years ago, calling it insurance. I hadn't understood until now how right he was. Franklin set the deed on his desk and pulled a notepad toward him. "We move on 3 fronts. First, Harvey Cole. He can freeze the business accounts until the validity of this will is settled. Second, Mark Jensen. He'll know exactly how to document the wetlands on this parcel. If we can prove any of that land is protected, development becomes nearly impossible. Third, Olivia Rhodes. We give her just enough to start digging into Sterling's record. The more public pressure, the better." I nodded, picturing each step as he spoke. "When do we start?" I asked. He gave a thin smile. "We already have. Harvey's expecting your call. Mark is in his office until 4. Olivia can meet you later this afternoon." I took Harvey's number and dialed from Franklin's desk. His voice was warm but edged with concern when I explained what had happened. "Leave it with me, Eleanor," he said. "I'll place a hold on all outgoing transfers from the orchard's accounts pending verification. No one moves a cent without my approval." Relief loosened something in my chest. One line of defense was already in place. Next was Mark. He answered on the second ring, his tone brisk until I mentioned the acreage and its location. "I know that stretch," he said. "If the stream running through it is still active, a section might be classified as a wetland. That would tie Sterling's hands in court. I can be out there tomorrow morning to take photos and file preliminary reports." He promised to call as soon as he had documentation. By the time I hung up, the tension in my shoulders had eased just enough for me to breathe deeper. Franklin leaned back, watching me. "Now, Olivia," he said, passing me the phone. I could already hear the click of her pen as she picked up. When I outlined the situation, careful to keep my voice even, she let out a low whistle. "Eleanor, you may have just handed me the lead I've been waiting for. Sterling is already fending off 2 lawsuits over environmental violations. If I can link those to this sale, they'll have more than bad press to worry about." She asked for copies of the deed and any correspondence from Sterling or my children. I promised to bring them to her office before the day was out. When I hung up, Franklin gathered the deed back into its envelope and pushed it toward me. "Keep this on you at all times. Until this is over, that piece of paper is your shield." I slipped it back into my bag, the leather warm from the heat of my hand. Outside, the wind had calmed, but the air still carried that crisp edge. I pulled my coat tighter and started toward Main Street, my mind focused on the path ahead. For the first time since Richard's funeral, I felt the ground under my feet begin to steady. Harvey called just after lunch, his voice low but firm. "The holds are in place, Eleanor. Nothing moves in or out of the orchard's accounts until this matter is resolved. If they try to withdraw the bank, we'll flag it immediately." I thanked him, feeling a rush of relief at having one more wall between David and what he thought was his. Not long after, my phone buzzed again. Mark had spent the morning walking the property lines on the 18 acres. He said the stream was flowing strong and part of the lower field was saturated enough to qualify as protected wetlands. "I've already sent the preliminary report to the Department of Environmental Conservation," he told me. "Once it's on record, any attempt to build will trigger a violation." His quiet efficiency reminded me why Richard trusted him. By mid-afternoon, Olivia met me in the back booth of the diner. She slid a manila folder toward me without preamble. "These are documented complaints and violations against Sterling from 3 different counties. 2 are ongoing lawsuits." She outlined her plan to run a feature in the Gazette by the end of the week with enough evidence to make any buyer nervous. Her eyes had that spark I'd seen before, the look of someone who knew they were holding a story worth telling. I walked back to Clara's bakery with the folder under my arm, the late light slanting gold across Main Street. I had just stepped inside when the phone in my bag rang, an unfamiliar number flashing on the screen. I answered, and a smooth male voice introduced himself as an acquisitions director for Sterling Developments. "Mrs. Whitmore, we understand there's been some hesitation about the sale. I wanted to speak to you personally." He went on about the benefits, how quickly they could close, how generous they could be to make this transition easier. Then, with a deliberate pause, he added, "And of course there's always room for a personal consideration. Something just for you off the record if you're willing to sign promptly." My hand tightened around the phone. I let him talk, keeping my voice even as I asked a few careful questions, my other hand sliding into my bag for the small recorder I kept there. I pressed the button and set it on the table beside me. He mentioned figures hinted at a wire transfer, all while assuring me no one else would need to know. I made a sound that could be mistaken for interest, then told him I would think it over. When the call ended, I stopped the recording and slipped it into my coat pocket. An hour later, another envelope arrived by courier. Inside was a letter from a Burlington law firm representing David and Samantha. The language was sharp and clinical, accusing me of obstructing a lawful transaction and threatening to seek damages if I continued to interfere. I read it twice, the corners of my mouth tightening. They were done pretending now. I placed the letter beside the recorder on the kitchen table, 2 pieces of evidence that told the same story from different angles. Outside, the streetlights were flickering on, and the hum of traffic in town was giving way to the quieter rhythm of evening. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat down, the steam curling upward as I stared at the recorder. In their rush to push me aside, they were handing me exactly what I needed. I reached for the phone and scrolled to the number Richard had insisted I keep in my address book for years. Robert Ellis answered on the second ring, his voice warm with recognition. "Eleanor, I heard about Richard. I am so sorry." I closed my eyes for a moment before telling him I needed his help not just as an old friend, but as the kind of lawyer who knew how to dismantle predators like Sterling Developments. He listened without interrupting as I explained everything from the forged will to being left on the side of Maple Hollow Road. I could hear his breathing shift when I described the 18 acres and the water rights. When I finished, there was a pause, then his voice came back with a sharper edge. Sterling has crossed my desk before. I beat them 3 years ago when they tried to muscle a vineyard owner into selling. They don't like losing, and they don't forget it. I told him about the recorder, the letter from David and Samantha, and the work Franklin had already set in motion. Robert asked me to send scans of both pieces of evidence immediately. I slipped the letter into my printer's scanner and attached the audio file to the same email. While it was sending, I heard the faint sound of papers shuffling on his end of the line. I still have their corporate filings from the last time I went up against them, he said. If they're operating in Brooke County, they have to meet state environmental compliance, and if they haven't, it will be in the records. His typing quickened, and I could almost picture him leaning over his desk, the way he used to lean over a chessboard, plotting 4 moves ahead. Found it, he said finally. They were cited last summer in Greenfield County for contaminating a tributary during site grading. It's still under investigation, which means they cannot legally bid on projects near protected waterways. That stream on your 18 acres would qualify. If we put this in front of the right agency, they'll be blocked before they can even appeal. The weight that lifted from my shoulders was tempered by the knowledge that we would need to move fast. How quickly can you act? I asked. Robert's tone was resolute. Tonight, I'll draft a notice of intent to file with the Environmental Enforcement Division, and I'll copy Sterling's counsel. It will tell them they're already in violation before they even break ground. I'll also alert the county board. Once word spreads, they'll know they're cornered. I could hear the scratch of his pen as he jotted notes. You'll need to be ready for them to push back hard, Eleanor. They'll try to intimidate you, maybe even smear your name. I looked at the recorder on the table and thought of David's voice offering me a way out that would keep everything quiet. Let them try, I said. Every threat, every lie, it all goes in my file. Robert chuckled a short, dry sound. That's the Eleanor I remember. I'll call you in the morning with updates, but keep your phone close tonight. Oh, if they sense the net tightening, they might reach out before we make our move. I promised I would and thanked him before hanging up. The house was still except for the ticking of the old kitchen clock. I gathered the deed, the recorder, and the letter into my bag, locking it before carrying it upstairs. In my bedroom, I set the bag beside the nightstand where I could reach it without thinking. Through the window, Main Street was quiet, the shop lights winking out one by one. Somewhere in that stillness, I knew the first cracks were beginning to form in Sterling's plans. Franklin called just after sunrise and told me to be at his office by 10. Robert would be there. I dressed in a plain navy dress and my warmest coat, tucking the deed, the recorder, and the letter into my bag before stepping out into the crisp morning. The walk to Elm Street felt shorter than usual, my steps steady, my mind fixed on what needed to be done. When I arrived, Franklin's secretary ushered me straight into the conference room. Robert was already seated at the head of the long oak table, a stack of documents neatly arranged before him. Franklin stood near the window, arms folded, his gaze calm but alert. Across from them sat David and Samantha. David's jaw was set, his suit pressed to perfection, though there were shadows under his eyes. Samantha's hair was pulled back tightly, her makeup just a shade too heavy, the tissue in her hand already crumpled. I took my seat opposite them, setting my bag on the table within reach. Robert wasted no time. You have 2 options, he said, his voice even but carrying the weight of finality. Sign the documents in front of you, relinquishing all claims to the Whitmore Orchard, the house, and all associated assets, or face criminal charges for willful fraud, elder exploitation, and the attempted theft of property worth over $8 million. David leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. Let's be reasonable. This can be resolved without threats. Franklin's eyes narrowed. Reasonable would have been not forging your father's signature. Reasonable would have been not abandoning your mother on the side of the road. Samantha's eyes flicked toward me, glistening. Mom. I didn't want it to go this far. I shook my head. You stood there and let it happen. Her lips trembled and she looked down at the tissue in her lap. David's voice sharpened. "If we sign, what do we get?" Robert answered before I could. "You get to walk out of here without a criminal record. That is all." David gave a short laugh with no humor in it. "And if we refuse?" I reached into my bag and placed the recorder on the table, pressing play. His voice filled the room, smooth and deliberate, offering me a personal payoff to sign quickly. Then I slid the lawyer's letter beside it. "Refuse, and these go straight to the prosecutor and the state attorney general before the day is out." The color drained from Samantha's face. David's fingers tapped against the arm of his chair, a faint but restless rhythm. Robert pushed the documents toward them, placing a pen on top. "Sign them now," he said. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Finally, David reached for the pen, scrawling his name in a quick, hard motion. Samantha hesitated, her eyes meeting mine for a brief moment before she signed. Her hand shook enough that the letters wavered. I pulled the documents toward me, scanning the signatures before closing the folder. "You will both leave Brooksville today," I said. "If I see either of you in this town again, the charges go forward." David stood first, slipping the pen back onto the table with a sharp click. Samantha followed, her shoulders slumped, the tissue still clenched in her hand. They walked out without another word, the door closing behind them. I sat back, letting the quiet settle in the room, the papers warm under my fingertips. The orchard was mine again, but the weight of what they had tried lingered in the air like a shadow. The drive back to the farmhouse was quiet except for the steady hum of the tires on the road. The gravel in the driveway crunched under my wheels as I pulled in, the late afternoon light spilling across the front porch. Inside, the air felt different, as if the house itself had been holding its breath. I went upstairs and stopped in the doorway of my bedroom. Drawers were half open, a scarf draped across the floor, and Richard's cedar box sat on the bed with its lid askew. The faint scent of his aftershave still lingered, but the contents had been rifled through. I began putting things back where they belonged, smoothing the folded shirts he had worn in every season, lining up the books on his nightstand. Each small act felt like reclaiming a part of the room from the intrusion. I tucked the cedar box back into the closet and shut the door firmly. The quilt lay rumpled at the foot of the bed, so I spread it neatly over the mattress, pressing my palm along the seams Richard's mother had stitched decades ago. The familiar order settled my mind. Downstairs, I made tea and carried it to the kitchen table. Through the window, I saw Rachel Jensen walking up the path, her hair pulled back, a stack of folders under one arm. She was starting as the new orchard manager today, and her presence was like the first sign of spring after a long winter. We walked the property together, and I showed her the irrigation controls, the storage sheds, and the equipment Richard had maintained so carefully. She took notes, quickly asked sharp questions, and I could see why Mark had recommended her. By mid-morning the next day, Olivia's article was on the front page of the Gazette. The headline named Sterling Developments, outright detailing the forged, the environmental violations, and the local opposition to their plans. A photo of the orchard in bloom from years past stretched across the top. By noon, copies were in every shop and cafe in Brooksville. People stopped me on Main Street to say they were glad I had stood my ground. Harvey waved from the bank steps, calling out that he had fielded 3 calls from reporters asking about Sterling's accounts. The effect spread quickly. Sterling issued a statement denying wrongdoing, but within hours the State Environmental Agency announced a full review of their permits. Olivia called to tell me a Burlington television station wanted to run the story, and by evening it was being discussed on regional radio. The phone rang often that night, friends and neighbors offering support or sharing their own stories about fighting developers. 2 days later, Clara came into the bakery kitchen where I was helping with a batch of cinnamon rolls. She had the Gazette folded under her arm, a grin on her face. Heard the latest David's firm in New York put him on indefinite leave pending an internal review, and Samantha's condo in Boston was foreclosed last month. The lender is selling it off to cover her debts. The news settled over me with a strange calm. I didn't feel triumph exactly, but there was a quiet sense of balance, as if the scales had tipped back to where they belonged. Word of their downfall made its way through Brooksville faster than any official announcement could. At the post office, Mrs. Keller murmured that she always knew Richard's children had a mean streak. At the farmer's market, someone pressed an apple pie into my hands with a wink, saying it was good to see the orchard still in the right hands. In the evenings, I would sit on the porch with a blanket over my knees, listening to the murmur of voices from the street, and the occasional sound of laughter drifting up from the sidewalk. The house felt whole again, and so did I. The orchard beyond the porch was still bare-limbed in the cool air, but buds had begun to swell on the branches, small promises of what was to come. By the time autumn settled over Brooksville, the orchard was heavy with fruit. The branches, bent under the weight of red and gold apples, the air sweet with their scent. The grass between the rows was matted from so many footsteps, and the sound of laughter carried from the far end of the field where neighbors were filling baskets. It was the kind of harvest Richard had always dreamed of, the kind that made the months of work feel like a gift. I had spent weeks planning the community gathering, wanting it to be more than a celebration of the season. Long tables were set up under the old maples covered in checkered cloths and lined with pies, cider, and warm bread. Children ran between the chairs, their cheeks flushed from the crisp air. Clara brought trays from the bakery, Harvey brought cider from his own press, and Rachel had organized a display showing the orchard's plans for the next year. When the sun dipped low, I stood and called for everyone's attention. Faces turned toward me, some I had known for decades, others new but already part of the fabric of this place. I spoke about Richard, about his belief that the orchard was not just land, but a legacy. Then I told them about the Richard Whitmore Scholarship Fund created to support local students who wanted to study sustainable agriculture. A murmur went through the crowd, followed by warm applause. I saw Franklin smiling from the edge of the tables and Robert giving a small nod. As the evening wore on, lanterns were lit and the conversation softened. I slipped away to the porch, carrying a mug of hot cider. From there, the orchard stretched out before me, rows of trees glowing in the lantern light strung along the main path. The air was cool enough to raise goosebumps on my arms, but I didn't mind. I thought about Maple Hollow Road, about the gravel under my shoes that morning, and the sound of David's voice telling me I was no longer his responsibility. The memory no longer stung. It felt like a scene from someone else's life, a chapter closed. Choosing justice had not been easy. It had meant cutting away what was once dearest to me, accepting that forgiveness was not always the right answer. I had kept what mattered most, not just the orchard, but my own self-respect. In that choice, I had found a freedom I did not know I was missing. The voices from the tables drifted up to the porch, and I could smell the cinnamon from the pies cooling on the dessert table. I wrapped my hands around the mug, feeling its warmth seep into my skin. The night was still the kind of stillness that tells you the work is done and you can rest. If you were standing where I stood with the chance to forgive or to hold the line for justice, which would you choose? I would love to hear your thoughts. Share your stories, and let me know, because in the end, these choices shape not just our lives but the legacy we leave behind.